For chapter 41, we'll be looking at muscles in this first video, and then there will be a second video looking just at the skeleton. We have a case study here, and it looks at Usain Bolt. And so he actually had some records, world records that he had. And he was pretty fast for a 100-meter dash, but that's a relatively short distance. However, you also have marathon runners and they have their own records, and so those are very large distances. And so the speed you run at a 100-meter dash is going to be nowhere near these, it's going to be way faster, nowhere near these speeds that you're running at a marathon. So those are two different kinds of distances. And we'll talk about later on why distance matters and the different kinds of muscles that are used in each part, and really the subtype of muscles and how they differ. So for instance, here we see that no one has actually run a mile faster than 3.71 minutes. And if you're me, nothing faster than 8 minutes. So I'm a little bit slow when it comes to that world record. College actually did run half marathons. The world record in 2008 for marathons, so that's about 26 miles. That's 2 hours, 1 minute, and 39 seconds. The fastest half marathon I've ever ran is actually about 2 hours, 1 minute, and 39 seconds. So the world record is about twice as fast as I can run. The fastest I've run. And so the big deal on this marathon is that this speed was kept up for the entire duration of it for a pretty far distance. And so when studying something like speed, especially when it comes to running, uh, bone density and muscle density play a really big part in endurance. So it may be kind of difficult to tell from this picture, but the sprinter typically has um, bigger quads and is bulky in general and a lot muscular. And then the marathon runner tends to be thinner and leaner. But looking at both these people, like the quads on the marathon runner are nothing to scoff at. Those are still pretty engaged muscles, but in a sprinter you typically see quadriceps or the upper leg muscles be a lot bigger and thicker. All right, so in this chapter, we're going to be starting off looking at how muscles contract, the different kinds of muscles, three main kinds, and then in the second video, how muscles and skeletons work together. So muscle is something you're going to find in almost all animals, and it's a tissue that's purpose is to contract. And combined with something else like a skeleton, whether that's an internal or an external skeleton, exerting force so that you can move. And so the three types, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So skeletal muscle, that's the one we're going to spend the most amount of time talking about. And so as skeletal muscles imply, these are going to be the kinds of muscles under voluntary control that are going to attach to your skeletal system. And so these muscles are going to be tough and composed of different filaments, which we'll get into. But ultimately, they're going to be supported by by tendons and ligaments, and we'll get into that later on. So skeletal muscles, they can either produce a wide variety of kinds of contractions. And so typically we think of that as like slow twitch and fast twitch. So slow and sustained, or fast and really powerful. But in reality, it's sort of a wide range, almost a continuous scale. When it comes to the amount of contraction we can generate, this is something that plays a big deal in humanoid robots. So robotic engineers, something as simple as trying to get a robot to grasp an object without crushing it, shows you how important being able to vary the amount of force generated by your muscles is. So we can pick up both things that are delicate and things that are not. And we can exert a lot of force to pick up a heavy box, but we can also pick up smaller objects without damaging them. And so we'll talk about how that control is regulated and generated. So here we just see skeletal muscle structure. You're going to have a muscle, which is a tissue made up of muscle cells. And so muscle cells are called muscle fibers, and muscle fibers will be bound together to make muscles. And in each muscle fiber or muscle cell, you'll actually see long units of myofibrils. And then we'll talk about what those myofibrils are made out of as well. So blood vessels and nerves, they pass through the muscle and the space between these bundles. And then you're also going to have connective tissue wrapping everything together. And we'll get into where you see these kinds of tissues as well. So muscle fibers do vary in length. And then the longest one you'll see is about 2 feet. But in general, individual muscle fibers are going to range from 10 to 100 micrometers in diameter. So relatively thin in diameter. But as far as the length goes, you can see them being up to 2 feet or 60 centimeters. And so skeletal muscles, they're going to contain lots of nuclei. So this is when we talk about in Bio 1, where mitosis is really division and duplication of the chromosomes and division of the nucleus. And sometimes cytokinesis happens. This is that exception where cytokinesis doesn't happen. The nucleus will divide into two, but it's still in that one muscle cell. So muscle cells will have multiple nuclei, and this is really like the exception to the rule. Typically, whenever you see nuclear division, that's typically followed by cellular division as well. And ultimately, these nuclei are there to direct the synthesis of enzymes and structural proteins. They're necessary for these cells' continued development and repair. All right, so these myofibrils, they're parallel cylindrical structures, and they are really important for the function of the muscles. So myofibrils, they're going to be surrounded by sarcoplasmic reticulum, and this will come into play a little bit later as well. And then, so the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it is a specialized kind of ER, or endoplasmic reticulum, and it has flattened membrane enclosed compartments filled with fluid. And then you're going to have calcium ions in this fluid. So here we see there's quite a few different parts to a skeletal muscle fiber. You're going to see multiple nuclei. You're going to see a lot of mitochondria. You're going to see sarcoplasmic reticulum, and these structures called T-tubules as well. And then, of course, those myofibrils. So the plasma membrane around your muscle fibers, they're going to form those T-tubules that we just talked about. And those tubules, they tunnel beneath the muscle fiber at regular intervals. And we'll see why in a couple of slides. And so each myofibril consists of repeating subunits called sarcomeres. So these are really the functional contractile unit of muscle cells, of these muscle fibers. And so they align end to end, and they connect to each other by something called Z-discs. They're a type of protein. So here we have a sarcomere, a functional contractile unit of a myofibril. And so these functional contractile units consist of a thick filament and a thin filament, which are going to slide across each other. These individual filaments don't change length, but they will slide past each other to effectively contract or relax. So muscle fibers don't lengthen, they only relax to their normal length, or they contract to a shorter length. And so the arrangement of these thin and thick filaments, they give muscles their characteristic striped appearance. And so you have really thick filaments that are suspended between these thin filaments. So the myofibrils, you're going to see two main kinds of proteins, actin and myosin. So actin can be found in the thin filaments and myosin in the thick filaments. And so these thin filaments, they're going to have like a pearl necklace beaded type structure, whereas in the thick filaments, they're going to be covered with all of these heads called myosin heads that they can sort of contract back and forth, sort of contract and relax these heads. They pivot back and forth. And then you're going to have accessory proteins such as troponin and tropomyosin. Here we're going to watch a brief video. All right, and so in this next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the physics behind that contracting of that sarcomere. What exactly happens? Essentially, these thick and thin filaments can slide past one another, and as they do, they grip on certain attachment points to sort of sustain that shortened or contracted nature for a bit of time. And we'll talk about what triggers the release and return to the normal attachment points in the next few slides. So in a resting muscle, the active sites on actin are covered by the accessory protein tropomyosin. And so at the response of your nervous system, an action potential is going to travel down and it's going to cause the tropomyosin to move off the binding sites. And so here we sort of have a cyclic view of a contraction. And so once you have an energized myosin head, it's going to be using ATP. It's going to attach to the binding site on actin. So the myosin head will be attracted to the binding site on actin. And so once that happens, the bound myosin head flexes, releasing energy that is used to pull the thin filament towards the center of the sarcomere. And then you have that ADP released. And then in the next stage, a new ATP molecule binds and causes a myosin head to detach from the actin. And then the myosin head breaks down ATP into ADP and that phosphate and is energized into the upright position. And so then it can then grab another active site. So essentially you have ATP being used to sort of energize the myosin head to grab different attachment sites on the thin filaments. And as it does that, you'll have that thin filament and thick filament essentially sliding past another. So you can almost think of it as being reeled in. ATP allowing the reeling in of the muscle or the shortening of the muscle by using those myosin heads to grab further and further attachment points. One thing to note, as part of the contraction process, it's called the sliding filament mechanism. It shortens all these sarcomeres along the muscle fiber simultaneously. So here again, we just have a sort of representation between a relaxed muscle and a fully contracted muscle. And then you also have a fully extended muscle as well. So here we have a relaxed muscle up top, fully contractile muscle, the sarcomere functional unit is shortened, and in a fully extended muscle, you have the sarcomere maximally extended. And then here we're going to have a video on the sliding filament model. So continuing on, this pulling of the muscle fibers past each other, as done by the myosin head, is called its power stroke. And so it uses its stored energy to create this stroke, pulling the actin filament towards the center of the sarcomere. And then once it does, the head becomes relaxed and can accept another ATP, which can then pull it again a little bit further if necessary, depending upon the stimuli. So as far as where this ATP occurs, there you have the process of cellular respiration. So, however, you also can have ATP that's stored in skeletal muscle reserves. And so it depends on what kind of activity you're doing, slow and sustained activity or brief high intensity activity. And so if your muscle activity is really high intensity and brief, you're going to, of course, use up those ATP reserves in a few seconds, and then you can generate a little bit more using glycolysis. So that's technically sort of the first stage of cellular respiration that happens uh, in the cytosol of your cells. And then for that low intensity sustained exercise, you're going to be using the mitochondria to generate ATP at that point. And so, of course, the mitochondria is where you have the main portion of cellular respiration occur. All right, so are there different kinds of muscle fibers that get engaged in the high intensity short exercise versus the slower, lower intensity demands? The answer is yeah, essentially. So skeletal muscle fibers actually come in two different types, the slow twitch and the fast twitch. And so they're designed a little bit differently, but in the slow twitch ones, you're actually going to have the same basic function, the same basic sliding ones, but then at a relatively slow pace. And then for the fast twitch ones, you're going to have a faster, more higher intensity pull. And so really with slow twitch fibers, you're going to see less contractile power generated than your fast twitch muscles. However, in slow twitch muscles, they can keep on contracting for an extended period of time. So that's where you have that slow, weaker, sustained power. And so slow twitch muscles, they're going to have a large number of mitochondria used for cellular respiration. So to support getting that full ATP out of glucose the cells uptake. And so you're going to have that glycolysis, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, then you're going to have the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. So typically like the full cellular respiration, trying to extract the full amount of energy as possible, involving the specialized energy producing organelle, the mitochondria, all that's going to happen with the slow twitch muscle fibers. Also going to have high levels of something called myoglobin, similar to hemoglobin, but it stores oxygen. And so oxygen is needed because it serves as a terminal electron acceptor in really in the electron transport chain. So in the electron transport chain, you pass off essentially the electrons to progressively more and more electronegative proteins until you need something that's super electronegative at the end, which is oxygen. So really, in cellular respiration, you want to use a lot of different steps to gradually extract out usable chemical energy from glucose. Of course, if you pull too much energy out at once, that's actually called an explosion, an explosive combustion reaction. In order to pull out energy slowly, you have to divide it up into all these different steps. And so these fast twitch muscle fibers, again, greater force than slow twitch. You also have a smaller blood supply and less myoglobin and fewer mitochondria. And so they're going to rely heavily on glycolysis to generate their ATP. But as a trade-off, they also fatigue more rapidly. So skeletal muscles, those are going to be the ones that you are actively under your conscious control, controlling via your nervous system. Specifically, these skeletal muscle fibers are excited by motor neurons. And so these motor neurons are going to originate in the spinal cord, and then their axons are going to be the portion that interfaces with the muscle fibers at the neuromuscular junction. And so neurons and nerves, they don't actually like touch the specialized cells that they're interacting with. There's a small gap there called a synapse. And so nerve or neuron that gets excited will propagate down an electrochemical signal, which will then, once it reaches the end of that axon, will release a neurotransmitter, which can either stimulate the next nerve or neuron or stimulate like an endpoint like the muscle cells. And the neurotransmitter used specifically for the neuromuscular junction is going to be acetylcholine. So here we have a picture of the top left. You're going to have the axon of the motor neuron. And then again, you can see the neurotransmitters propagating that stimulating signal to the muscle cells via a synapse that occurs across the neuromuscular junction. And that signal that's propagated, again, that electrochemical signal is propagated through a process called an action potential. So without getting too much into what an action potential is, it's like a minimum threshold for an excitatory signal to propagate down across the nerves to its endpoint. And so an excitatory event generates an action potential that propagates down through the neuron, releases the neurotransmitters, and then that action potential will then propagate down through those T-tubules till it gets to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, there's going to be released calcium ions. And then when calcium ions bind to one of those accessory proteins, specifically troponin, it's then going to pull that tropomyosin off of those binding sites on those beaded pearl necklace structures called the actin. So calcium is important for muscle contraction, specifically because it allows indirectly the active sites for these individual like filaments of the muscles to be exposed. And once they're exposed, you can then have that myosin head progressively move past them, essentially shortening the sarcomere, or the functional unit. And again, like that shortening of that unit and that movement of that myosin head requires ATP. So you have a lot of things going on here. Calcium, ATP, the interaction between the neurons and your muscle cells, all sorts of things. So one thing to important to note is that the action potential, the presence of calcium. Once the action potential is done, then active transport will basically just pump that calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so that basically signals the the end of the contraction, so it shouldn't contract. The muscle cell shouldn't anymore because it's no longer receiving a signal from the neuron. Um, so calcium will come off that accessory protein, troponin, which will then allow tropomyosin to cover back up those active sites on the actin, so that beaded pearl necklace will no longer have exposed binding sites. So then you won't have the myosin head be able to move across it anymore. And so in this process of pumping calcium released by a single action potential back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, there's a little bit of delay. It takes long enough to allow hundreds of myosin head movement cycles. So that coordinated movement causes a visible twitch of the muscle fibers. And here we have another short video. All right, so earlier I talked about being able to control the force that your muscle fibers generate to be able to not damage items you pick up, unlike robots. And so force, distance, and duration of muscle contraction are determined by how many fibers in the muscle contract, how much they contract, and for how long. So you have, because this is happening at essentially the cellular level, you can finely control what's going on. So a motor neuron typically synapses with multiple muscle fibers in a single muscle, forming essentially what's called a motor unit. And so these motor units can vary in size. Um, so those used like in the eyes and the fingers, motor units are going to be smaller because it requires more fine-tuned control. And then um, those in like the legs and used for walking, for instance, those are going to have larger motor units because you're trying to incorporate uh, larger groups of muscles at the same time. And so essentially, you're going to have synapses on dozens or even hundreds of muscle fibers, allowing powerful but less precise movements. And so, because the muscle fibers are attached to one another and to the muscle's tendons, a single action potential in a single motor neuron will cause a small twitch to the entire muscle. Basically, everything sort of moves together since it's attached. Okay, so this is really the end of our conversation about skeletal muscles as far as uh, their their unique properties. Now we're going to talk about those other two kinds of muscles, cardiac and smooth ones, and they differ in some interesting ways. For instance, those multinucleated cells that I was talking about, you're going to really only find that in skeletal muscles. Cardiac muscles, which of course make up the heart, you're going to have one cell per one nuclei per cell. And in the smooth muscles, which are going to be used for things like digestion and breathing, not under conscious control, you're also going to have one nuclei per cell. Skeletal muscles also are really like the quickest acting, potentially the quickest acting kinds of muscles, but you can also use them in a slow controlled manner as well. Cardiac is going to be intermediate in speed of contraction, and smooth muscle is going to be slow in speed of contraction. And so, continuing with those differences in your smooth muscle, that's going to control the movement of substances through tubes and hollow organs. So think of blood vessels as well as digestive tract. And then main purpose of your cardiac muscles in the heart will be to pump blood. Cardiac muscle, or basically essentially heart muscle, um, it's also striated because it has those regular arrangements of sarcomeres with thick and thin filaments like skeletal muscle cells have. Um, but cardiac muscle fibers are branched though, and they typically are much shorter than muscle skeletal fibers. Cardiac muscles also have intercalated discs, and this helps both propagate the action potential or the signal rapidly among all the fibers, and also helps keep them bound together so the force of contraction doesn't tear them apart. And so cardiac muscles, you're going to, well, your heart's always beating, like even when you're sleeping, as opposed to like your skeletal muscle cells where they vary wildly in the uh, amount of force and the speed of the contractions you sort of need them for. Skeletal muscles vary wildly. Cardiac muscles, most of the time, you're probably at rest unless you're actively running or carrying something. So, in general, at rest, your heart rate beats per minute will be around 70. And so what that means is that your cardiac muscle fibers require a large uninterrupted supply of oxygen because they always need to use ATP. Whereas in skeletal muscles, the amount of ATP and oxygen varies wildly. You also have a lot of mitochondria in cardiac muscles, which could actually make up about 35% of the mass of cardiac fibers. Also, cardiac muscles are essentially autorhythmic, so they actually can contract on their own. They need a pacemaker to coordinate that contraction, but if you remove like heart muscle cells, they will just beat by themselves in the petri dish. We talked about in a previous chapter, uh, if your heart muscle is not coordinated to beat together, that's called an arrhythmia. So it won't effectively pump blood, and you need a defibrillator to actually coordinate them back again. So smooth muscle going into that third different kind surrounds blood vessels, and so their need to essentially constrict or expand correlate to the amount of blood you need in any one area at any given time. Um, So for instance, your muscle cells also require skeletal muscle cells require a different amount of oxygen and by contrast blood flow depending upon which muscles you're using at the time. So your blood vessels can constrict and expand uh, in relationship to controlling that. You also see in hollow organs including the uterus, bladder, and digestive tract. So generally these are not under voluntary control. And ultimately, when it comes to like skeletal muscles, the whole point is to exert a force on the skeleton. So we're actually going to stop it about there for this one. And then you guys can join me for the second video where we get more into what the skeleton is.